In 2025, something is happening that nobody expected. A silent exodus. A quiet rebellion. A growing wave of men stepping away from dating, not because they hate women, not because they're bitter, but because they've discovered something more rare, more valuable, more stabilizing than modern love: peace. And the craziest part? Almost nobody is talking about it publicly. But behind closed doors, in group chats, online forums, gym locker rooms, late-night car conversations, the same confession keeps coming up again and again. I'm happier alone than I ever was dating. It's not a trend born out of anger. It's not a movement triggered by trauma. It's a practical response to a world that has fundamentally changed, a world where dating feels more like survival than romance, where connection feels more like a gamble than a gift. For generations, men were raised on one script: work hard, be stable, find a woman, build a life. That was the formula. That was the definition of success. But in 2025, men are looking at that script and asking a question nobody dared ask before: does any of this still make sense? And for an increasing number of men, the honest answer is no. Not anymore. Not in an economy where rent eats half your income. Not in a dating culture where commitment has become something people fear instead of value. Not in a world where you can pour your time, energy, attention, and money into someone who can replace you with a swipe before the night is over. So men are doing something radical, something unthinkable a decade ago. They're choosing themselves. The truth is simple but uncomfortable. Dating in 2025 feels like a luxury hobby for many men, not a path to partnership. The cost of a single date can rival a week of groceries. The emotional labor can drain more energy than a full workday. And the mental toll? It can take weeks to recover from a situationship that never even had a name. Men aren't stepping back because they don't want love. They're stepping back because they can't keep paying the price modern dating demands without losing themselves in the process. They're tired of being invisible on apps. Tired of being compared to unrealistic social media fantasies. Tired of chasing clarity in a world that celebrates ambiguity. They're tired of the games, the ghosting, the hot and cold cycles, the emotional roller coasters disguised as connection. And most of all, they're tired of feeling like they're auditioning instead of being seen. But here's what makes this moment different. Men aren't stepping back into loneliness. They're stepping back into their own lives. Into hobbies. Into health. Into financial literacy. Into career goals. Into friendships. Into peace. They're discovering that solitude isn't a punishment, it's a superpower. That coming home to a clean, quiet space isn't emptiness, it's freedom. That sitting alone in a cafe isn't sad, it's self-respect. And somewhere along the way, in the stillness, in the silence, in the absence of drama and disappointment, they start to feel something shocking: contentment. The modern world underestimated men's capacity to adapt. While dating has become heavier, more complicated, more expensive, men found a solution nobody saw coming: choosing not to play the game at all. Instead of chasing situationships, they're chasing stability. Instead of begging for attention, they're building discipline. Instead of looking for validation, they're learning to validate themselves. And surprisingly, this solitude doesn't make them weaker, it makes them stronger. More grounded. More focused. More intentional. They're replacing the emotional chaos of modern dating with structure, routine, ambition, and purpose. They're becoming men who don't crumble when love is missing, because they've built lives so full that love is a bonus, not oxygen. The old world taught men to fear solitude. The new world is teaching them to master it. And once a man discovers the peace of being alone, the special kind of quiet where his thoughts settle, his anxiety fades, his soul resets, it becomes nearly impossible to return to the exhausting uncertainty of modern dating. For many, it's not even a choice anymore. It's a necessity, a form of self-protection, a way to preserve their mental health in a world that burns it out. Men aren't avoiding relationships, they're avoiding chaos. They're avoiding disappointment. They're avoiding emotional instability packaged as chemistry. They're avoiding the draining effort of trying to impress people who don't value stability, loyalty, or consistency. And until someone extraordinary crosses their path, someone who brings peace, not problems, they would rather walk alone. Because in 2025, solitude is no longer a failure. It's a strategy, a shield, a sanctuary, a path to becoming the strongest version of themselves. And as more men choose this path, one thing becomes clear: solitude isn't the absence of connection, it's the beginning of an entirely new relationship, a relationship with themselves. As we move deeper into 2025, the shift becomes even more unmistakable. Men aren't just stepping back from dating, they're stepping into a version of themselves they never had time to meet before. And the surprising irony is that this transformation didn't start with strength. It started with exhaustion. Real, bone-deep exhaustion. The kind that builds up after years of trying to be enough for people who never intended to stay. The exhaustion of pouring effort into conversations that die overnight. The exhaustion of trying to decode mixed signals, double meanings, shifting boundaries, and expectations that move like fog. Eventually, something in a man breaks, not in anger, but in clarity. He wakes up one morning and realizes that the constant pressure to perform, entertain, impress, and prove himself is slowly draining the life out of him. And at that moment, solitude stops being scary and becomes a lifeline. Dating in 2025 feels like walking through a marketplace where everyone is browsing, nobody is buying, and you are the product. Men feel this. They feel the disposability. They feel the silent competition with thousands of other profiles. They feel the uncertainty of being one argument away from being ghosted or replaced. They feel the emotional volatility of people who don't know what they want but still want attention. And eventually, they look at this chaos and think, why am I sacrificing my peace for someone who sees me as optional? That simple question has changed the entire landscape. Because when a man realizes his presence can be replaced but his peace cannot, everything shifts. He stops chasing. He stops overinvesting. He stops begging to be chosen. And instead, he begins to choose himself, often for the first time in his adult life. He stops prioritizing short-term chemistry over long-term stability. He stops letting his self-worth rise and fall based on how many matches he got this week. He stops searching for validation in people who wouldn't notice if he disappeared. And in this pause, this sacred distance from the noise, he rediscovers something modern dating stole from him: the ability to breathe. And when a man finally has room to breathe, he thinks clearer. He becomes more self-aware. He starts asking deeper questions. What do I truly want? What kind of life am I building? Who am I when I'm not performing for someone else? And with these questions comes an uncomfortable truth. Many men realize they've never been in a relationship where they could be fully themselves. They've been edited versions, filtered versions, versions molded by expectations that were never theirs. So solitude becomes the first environment in years where they feel genuinely authentic. That authenticity builds power, quiet power. A man alone is not a man who has given up, he is a man sharpening. He's healing from emotional wounds he never acknowledged. He's building routines that make him disciplined instead of drained. He's creating financial stability without the pressure of dating expenses bleeding him dry. He's rediscovering passions he abandoned just to seem more dateable. He's reconnecting with male friendships that used to anchor him before dating took all his time. And slowly, without even meaning to, he becomes better. Mentally, physically, emotionally, financially. Modern dating asked men to be everything for someone else. Solitude asks them to be everything for themselves. And this shift creates a paradox nobody expected. The more time men spend alone, the less they're willing to give that piece up. Not for a situationship. Not for someone who isn't emotionally available. Not for someone who sees them as a backup plan. Not for someone who treats communication like a game. A man who has found stability in solitude becomes incredibly selective, not because he's arrogant, but because he's finally aware of what he brings to the table. And he refuses to offer that to someone who brings chaos instead of clarity. Another silent truth sits beneath all of this. A truth men rarely say out loud. Many of them chose solitude because it's the only place they feel respected. In the dating world, they feel judged, compared, dismissed, or tolerated. But in solitude, they feel whole. They feel in control. They feel valued by themselves instead of waiting to be valued by someone else. This shift from external validation to internal validation changes everything. A man who validates himself is nearly impossible to emotionally manipulate, and the dating world relies heavily on men who are uncertain of their worth. Once a man knows his worth, the entire dynamic collapses. 2025 men aren't running from dating, they're running towards something better, self-respect. They're choosing long-term emotional stability over short-term excitement. They're choosing financial independence over financial pressure. They're choosing mental clarity over emotional confusion. They're choosing peace over performance. And as they build this new life, this structured, self-directed, meaningful life, they start to notice the truth that society never taught them. Being alone doesn't mean being empty. Being alone doesn't mean being unlovable. Being alone doesn't mean being behind. Being alone can mean finally being aligned. And here's the plot twist. The men who choose solitude often become the very men women want most. Grounded, focused, emotionally regulated, ambitious, confident, purpose-driven. Men who cannot be controlled by fear of loneliness because they've mastered it. Men who cannot be manipulated by inconsistency because they don't need constant affection to feel whole. Men who cannot be rushed, pressured, or guilted into relationships because they don't view singlehood as a failure. But even then, many of them stay alone, not out of resentment, but out of discernment. Because once a man finally experiences life without drama, noise, or emotional instability, he won't give that up for anyone who isn't truly worth it. Solitude becomes his standard. Peace becomes his baseline. And love, if it comes, will have to meet him at the level of his new, higher self, not pull him back into the chaos he walked away from. By the time a man reaches this final stage of the journey, something profound has shifted inside him, so deeply and quietly that most people around him don't even notice. But he does. He feels it every morning when he wakes up without the weight of someone else's expectations on his chest. He feels it every night when his thoughts are finally his own instead of a replay of arguments, mixed messages, or unanswered questions. He feels it in the unexpected freedom that comes from realizing he no longer has to perform, impress, or chase anyone. And for the first time in years, he understands what peace actually feels like. Men in 2025 aren't just avoiding dating, they're detoxing from decades of emotional overstimulation. Modern relationships became another battlefield of demands, contradictions, and misunderstandings. Be vulnerable but not too emotional. Be strong but not too stoic. Take the lead but don't be controlling. Provide but don't be patriarchal. Text first but don't seem desperate. Be confident but not arrogant. Show affection but don't smother. Make plans but don't be boring. It's an impossible maze, and many men walked through it long enough to realize that no matter which door they choose, they end up blamed for something. Eventually, they step out of the maze entirely. And when they do, they're surprised to discover how quiet life becomes. Not empty, quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat again. The kind that allows your nervous system to finally unclench. Because before solitude, men lived in constant alert mode, always trying not to mess up, always trying to stay interesting enough, successful enough, emotionally available enough, but never too much of anything. This constant pressure broke something inside them. Solitude is the only place where that broken part begins to heal. Men start spending evenings differently, not refreshing messages hoping for replies, but reading books, going to the gym, building businesses, traveling alone, or finally sleeping without tension. They stop trying to prove their worth and instead begin to build it. They start journaling, meditating, planning, organizing, things they never had time or emotional space for when they were constantly adjusting themselves to fit into someone else's expectations. They reconnect with passions they silenced for years. Music, coding, gaming, hiking, writing, cooking. Anything that reminds them of who they were before the world convinced them that their value depended on someone choosing them. And somewhere along the way, something even more unexpected happens. They stop feeling lonely. They discover that loneliness wasn't caused by being alone, it was caused by being around people who made them feel unseen. Solitude becomes the cure, not the cause. They realize that being in a relationship where you feel misunderstood, judged, or undervalued is far lonelier than sitting in a quiet room by yourself. Men who choose solitude aren't escaping connection. They're escaping the pain of shallow, confusing, inconsistent connection. As this mindset grows, something else shifts. Men begin redefining masculinity for themselves rather than inheriting outdated scripts. They're no longer chasing validation through status symbols or romantic success. They're building identities based on competence, discipline, freedom, and inner peace. They're learning emotional intelligence not to impress anyone, but to understand themselves. They're building financial security not to provide for a partner, but to stabilize their own futures. They're practicing self-respect not because someone demanded it, but because they finally understand its value. In solitude, a man grows into a version of himself he didn't even know he could become. He becomes sharper, calmer, more intentional. He sees through manipulation faster. He detects red flags instantly. He sets boundaries without guilt. He understands the difference between attraction and compatibility. He knows that attention is cheap, but respect is priceless. He learns that real love isn't chaotic, confusing, or painful. It's stable, steady, and reciprocal. And because he now knows what real peace feels like, he refuses to trade it for drama disguised as passion. By this point, men no longer see relationships as the default path to fulfillment. They see them as an optional part of life, a part that must meet certain standards to be worth inviting into their world. A partner is no longer a necessity. She is a privilege. And if she brings instability, disrespect, or emotional games, he walks away without hesitation. Not because he's heartless, but because he's healed. He has rebuilt his identity around purpose, routine, goals, friendships, and passions. This makes him harder to manipulate and harder to access. It also makes him more attractive. But ironically, the more desirable he becomes, the less desperate he is to be desired. This is why the dating landscape feels so different in 2025. Men aren't disappearing. They're evolving. They're no longer participating in a system that drains them and gives little in return. They're setting a new standard: peace over pressure, growth over chaos, purpose over performance. And this standard is spreading quietly but powerfully. Some will say men are avoiding commitment. But that's not true. They're avoiding disappointment. They're avoiding instability. They're avoiding cycles of giving everything and receiving half effort in return. A man who has tasted the clarity of solitude no longer sees being single as a failure. He sees it as freedom. And he will not give up that freedom unless the relationship he enters multiplies his peace rather than subtracting it. The man in 2025 doesn't reject love. He rejects the version of love that hurts more than it heals. He rejects situationships that waste time, emotional labor that goes unrecognized, and relationships that demand self-sacrifice without reciprocity. He isn't bitter. He's awake. He isn't broken. He's rebuilding. He isn't lonely. He's selective. And he isn't waiting for someone to save him. He's saving himself. And as he continues to grow in solitude, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, something beautiful happens. He becomes whole. Not half of a future couple. Not an incomplete person seeking completion in someone else. A whole man. A man who knows that if love enters his life someday, it will be a welcome addition, not a rescue mission, not a dependency, not a replacement for a missing piece. And if love never comes, his life will still be full, meaningful, and deeply lived. That is why men are choosing solitude in 2025. Because for the first time in their lives, they've discovered that being alone is not something to fear. It's something to master. And once mastered, it becomes a foundation stronger than anything the modern dating world could ever offer.